Okay, we're recording, Rav.
Time, everybody. Time for our brothers and sisters in the Holy Land, for the soldiers.
What is this thing? Police and army. It's crazy.
What happened?
Settlers are attacking the armies.
Which state?
Which settlers?
Why would they do that?
They're crazy.
Is it anything to do with hostages?
Let's learn. And we got a place, everybody. Right now. Yeah, we're getting a lot of interference. I'm just going to mute the
two women that always are in these protests that are Jewish. These anti-Israel protests. So they're being paid. They're being paid by these.
Yeah, maybe.
So they asked the lady, you work, she says, no.
Our Jewish people,
I mean, in America.
they do Arab associations.
right. Words of Torah, the words of Torah over here dedicated to our soldiers. They should be successful. People should be successful. Everyone should be safe. And let's just get this thing on. Okay. Omar Rabbi Abo, Omar Rabbi Yochanan. We're over here. Rabbi Abo said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Minayin la zivayach bahem abalas mum la'avoy zara shehu patur. How do we know that if a person sacrifices an animal to avodah zara? I'm going to put that a bit lower. Why don't you? Okay, then mute it. You mute it on my side, but it's coming out over there. Okay. Maybe put the volume down. Minayin, yeah.
Number
13. Omar Rabbi Abo.
Are you sure?
Omar Rabbi Abo, Omar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Abo said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Minayin la zevech bahem balas mum, one sacrifices an animal that has a blemish to la avodah zara, to idolatrous deities, to an idol, shu potur, that such a person is exempt. How do we know that the person is exempt? Shenemar, from the pasuk, from the verse that says, Zavayach lo Elohim yocharam, he that sacrifices to the gods, that's other gods, will be destroyed, bilti Hashem levado, except to Hashem alone.
Sorry, what does it mean that he's exempted? He's
So basically,
a blemished animal. What's he exempt from?
so we've said already a principle in Avodah Zarah that in order to be oiver, in other words, in order to transgress the rules or the laws of serving Avodah Zarah, it has to be that you serve the Avodah Zarah in a specific kind of way. If you make up a service, is there any way to put the volume down there? It's still coming through.
Top left corner should be a speaker.
Even if you just put your volume down on your phone,
I have, it doesn't let me put it down all the way.
then you'll hear me.
Top left corner there should be a speaker. If you touch
Sorry,
it,
what?
No, I did that.
What page?
Just have a look at it. Doesn't
Page is, let me just say, the page is 51A. Nun Aleph, Daf Nun Amud Aleph.
Doesn't
Yeah.
allow me to read it.
No, there should be a speaker.
There must be some way to get the volume all the way down. Any phone.
It's fine.
Even if you, really, it doesn't let you put the volume all the way down. Okay, so coming back to what we were saying, if you fabricate your own service, that means that you decide to make your own cult or religion or whatever it is, and it hasn't been, there's no formal anything established around it, then that service is a joke. In other words, it's not. In order for either a Jew or a non-Jew, and I say a Jew or a non-Jew because both Jews and Gentiles are commanded with regard to Avodah Zarah. We're both not allowed to serve of idols. We're not allowed to serve deities. That's not Hashem himself.
No,
That's not the one God, Hashem above. But in order to be obligated, one of the main points that the Gemora makes, it's done it a few times, but here it will talk about it again, is that it must be one of two things. It must either be ka'ein pnim, which means a service that's similar to the way in which we serve Hashem. And you often get that because one of the interesting things is the religions of the world will tend to copy us. Most of the major religions of the world have taken different aspects from Judaism. For instance, if we have the concept of Mashiach, they'll take the concept of Mashiach, Messiah. If we have the concept of a seventh day of Shabbat, very few religions in the world leave Yiddishkeit alone completely. Very few people make an Avodah Zarah, a form of idolatry, and walk away entirely from any theme or any concept that's in Torah at all. They usually will find something to copy, paste, or imitate. Maybe because the truth of Torah gives things a certain power of lasting, a certain presence or authority. So basically what happens over here is the Torah is saying that in order to transgress the chiyuv, the liability of doing avodah zarah in a sacrificial offering, you sacrifice an animal, it must be ka'ein panim, it must be like the type of sacrifice that would be brought in the temple by Jewish people. If somebody follows the prescription of the way an offering would be brought in the temple by the Jewish people, the way we slaughter an animal and bring it as a sacrifice, and they go and bring the sacrifice to their deity, to their idol, their god, whatever it might be, that would be replicating our service, and that would be avodah zarah. Likewise, even if it's not our kind of service, but that particular idolatry develops an instruction, that it develops an instruction of some sort along that line, that's how they do it. But what's happening over here is one of the main rules in bringing offerings in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple, was that the animals had to be complete. The word that the Torah would always use is tamim, which means without blemish or whole or complete. No, that's a different word. Tamim is with a tes mem aleph. Tamim is with a taf mem yud final mem. Tamim. Or olat tamimah. We talk about a perfect.
Plural? Is that more
Sorry?
plural sense of
No blemish. It means
No
it's
blemish.
complete in the sense that it has physical perfection.
Oh,
There's no blemish. Tamim.
Okay.
Now, in fact, we had it in today's Torah reading. What was it? Today we read Zot
Okay.
V'Tat Torah. This is the sort of Torah.
But this is-
Hara Duma Tamimah.
yeah.
A red heifer that is complete. Asher Ein Ba Mum, that has no
Mum.
blemish.
Blemish.
A mum is a blemish. So basically what this Gemora is quoting, it's quoting a passage that if a person sacrifices an animal that has a mum, that has a blemish to avodah zarah, he's exempt, because that's not how we offer sacrifices. We offer sacrifices that are unblemished. And the source of it is Shenemar, as it says, there's a comparative in this verse. If you look at the expression, the fact that the Torah compares Zovayach lo Elohim, sacrificing to other gods, kivayachol, as if they were, sacrificing to other gods, to sacrificing to Hashem, tells us that they must be the same. Now, you probably all recall the famous story. We're coming up quite soon to the commemorate the times that the temple was destroyed. We're already in Tammuz. Soon will be Shivasa B'Tammuz, the 17th of Tammuz, the 3 weeks, the Bein HaMetzarim, followed by Tisha B'Av. And one of the main stories of Tisha B'Av is the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. You recall the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa as told in the Talmud? That the story where Bar Kamsa was invited instead of Kamsa, and then he was ejected from the meal, and he was very angry, and he was cross with the sages, and he went to the Romans, and he said to the Roman emperor, he wanted to make trouble for the Jewish people. You know, in modern day talk, it's like a Jew running to Iran to make trouble for Eretz Yisrael. So he went to the Romans in those days, and he wanted to make trouble. And he said to the Roman emperor a few things. He said, you know, the Jewish people, if a fly ends up in their wine, they flick it out of the wine and they carry on drinking. But if you would touch their wine, they won't be able to carry on drinking.
No.
In other words, he came up with a bunch of things out of context but he managed to rile up the emperor against the Jewish people. But the main one that he managed to do on this subject is he managed to persuade the emperor to send an offering to be offered in the temple. There was a concept that different kings, different peoples were allowed to bring. They called nadavas, donation offerings,
Rob,
were brought in the temple.
can I go off the
Yeah.
topic, but I heard that America's donating 30 billion to Iran. Did you hear about that?
Let's talk about positive stuff.
Why would they do that?
Anyway,
Analyze
but
it.
let's cover this and we can chat afterwards. So, anyways, he convinces the emperor to send this animal to be offered in the temple. But on the way back, what he did is he made a blemish on the animal, in order to try and orchestrate a situation that the sages in the temple, the sages at the Sanhedrin, who sit on the bench and make the big decisions, would reject the emperor's gift, the emperor's offering, and that would cause tsaros between us and the emperor. And what did he do? He specially made the tiniest little minute blemish that would only be a problem in the eyes of halacha, in the eyes of the sages, but not in the eyes of the emperor, because he knew that if the blemish was obvious, if it was a well-marked official blemish, the emperor himself would understand that that's a problem, because in days of old, there were sacrificial offerings that were brought by the Gentiles to, either to Hashem, if they were following the laws of Noah, or to whichever gods they offered. And they also were strict about the fact that an animal that was offered for any kind of sacrificial offering had to be complete. In other words, we spoke a similar language. We all knew what a blemish was, what a mum was. But he managed to make a mum which was just on the borderline between what we would consider a mum and what. And then the animal was brought to the sages. Some of the sages actually felt that for pikuach nefesh, meaning in order to save the Jewish people from the fate of angering the emperor, it should be offered anyway. There was one rabbi who said, no, we have to hold steadfast with our laws. And this is told as one of the main stories that sparked off the invasion and all of the tsaros that eventually led to Kurban Abayit, to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. So we're reminded of that when we look at this over here, where he says that if somebody sacrifices an animal that has a blemish to avodah zarah, he's patur, because the fact that it has a blemish means that it's not a real sacrifice. Hava bei Rava b'mai. The Gemora says that Rava was analyzing what type of blemish are we talking about over here. See, this is very similar to that story. That's why I mentioned the story. Ilaima bedukin sheba'ayin. Could we be talking about a blemish, a minor blemish on the cornea of the eye, which is something we would be concerned about? By the way, that type of blemish is minor enough that B'nai Noach, which means non-Jews, are not necessarily restricted from offering an animal with that type of blemish on their own platform, which is called a bomber. La'avodah zarah mibaya, we wouldn't need to teach anything, because this is clear. This is very clear. A bomber was, by the way, once upon a time, everybody could make a sacrificial offering on their own platform. So in other words, just like everyone owns their gas braai or their Weber braai or whatever, if people wanted to bring a korban, whether it was us, whether it was the nations of the world, people would have a platform. You could go to, what do we have nowadays? Hirsch's, Dion's, Stacks, and buy yourself an altar. That's how it was at that time. Everybody could bring a korban wherever they wanted to bring it. Not only that, until the Beit HaMikdash was built, even Jewish people were allowed to offer korbanos. We were allowed to offer offerings to Hashem above on a bama in one's own place. But what happened was, from the time that the Beit HaMikdash was built, from the time that the first Beit HaMikdash was built, it became asur, it became prohibited for Jewish people to offer sacrificial offerings to Hashem anywhere else. It's in our Yontif laning where it says clearly, only the place that Hashem will choose. Once Hashem chooses his permanent home in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem, in Yerushalayim HaKodesh, once God has chosen the Beis HaBechira, the chosen house, one of the ways that we honor the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, eternally, not only in the time of the temple, but even after, even in our own time, a Jew may not bring any kind of sacrificial offering, whether an animal, whether a mincha, whether a meal offering, any kind of offering except for prayer. The only thing we do is daven, which is similar to an offering, as we say in our davening. That we ask Hashem that because we can't bring offerings, we ask Hashem that the words of our lips, the utterances of our lips, the reciting of the halachas, of the laws to do with the korbanos of the offerings should give us the schut, the merit, as if we're bringing the offering itself. But the offering itself, we're not allowed to bring in other place. However, this law does not apply to B'nai Noach. You know, if you have Gentiles, and you do get some in the world who want to follow Jewish law, that's Jewish law as it pertains to Gentiles. They are allowed to offer on a bama anywhere. They're not restricted to offering sacrificial offerings in the place of the temple, the Beit HaMikdash. Furthermore, the type of wound that would cause an animal to be considered blemished is different. And therefore, the Gemora says, we have to say that when we talk about an animal that is considered blemished universally, whether according to Jews, whether according to what are the laws with reference to Gentiles, even the way, whether according to the way that Gentiles conduct their religions, a blemish has to be a clear and complete blemish. Like mechusar aver. Mechusar aver means literally missing a limb. It's an obvious blemish. Even a child would say, hey, that animal's missing a limb. Ela b'mechusar aver. Rabbi Elazar, like Rabbi Elazar, the Omer Rabbi Elazar, like Rabbi Elazar said, how do we know? Where does the Torah tell us that if B'nai Noach, if Gentiles want to offer offerings to Hashem above, an animal that is missing a limb is not allowed? If we go back to the ark, when Noah was commanded to bring animals into the ark, and he was told over there to bring the animals into the ark, the non-kosher animals, if you remember, a male and a female of each type, Shnaim ish ve'ishtoi, and when it came to the kosher animals, it was 7 and 7. And the reason for all the extra animals was because of the fact that he knew that after Hashem would save the world, he would have to bring offerings to praise Hashem and thank Hashem for saving him and his family and all those that survived in the Teva. So on that occasion, if you look at the wording of the Torah, it would indicate that those animals had to be complete. They weren't allowed, he wasn't supposed to select, when he selected those animals, mechusar aver, blemished animals, that for instance didn't have a limb. Shenemar, as it says, mikol achai, mikol basar, shnayim mikol, from all those alive of all flesh, any species, any animal species alive of all flesh, Shnayim mikol, he should bring 2 of each. Amra Torah, the Torah was saying, Hava b'heima shechayin roshe varim shelah. Bring an animal that its extremities, that its limbs are all alive, that everything there is completely alive. In other words, we always look for laws that are learned, extracted from extra words. When the Torah uses extra words, if Noach was rounding up animals in order to save them, you don't have to be told that he should round up live animals. He's not making biltong in there. He doesn't need dead animals. So if the Torah says hachai, the word alive, what is the reason for the assurance that the animal's alive? Besides for everything else, it was, according to this, they wanted to utilize that phrase to tell you that it must be completely alive. It mustn't have any dead limbs. Sadly, when one amputates, what it actually means is that limb no longer has chayes, it's no longer alive. So the Gemora says, from that word chay, alive, we learned that Noach was told that he could only select animals that don't have dead limbs, that don't have missing limbs, which was a lesson for all time, that if an animal's mechusar aver, if it's missing a limb, it's not fit to be brought as a sacrificial offering, even for B'nai Noach, not only for Jews, but even for Gentiles. But the Gemara says, no, we need that expression for other purposes. We we needed that B'kol Achai to exclude an animal that is called a treifa. So I think we've mentioned this before. Treif is a very common colloquial word. We say someone's kosher or it's treif. But treif actually has a very specific meaning. Sometimes meanings are expanded. The word treifa actually means, it comes from Torah torn, or torn apart, but it actually refers to a very specific situation where an animal has some kind of terminal condition that because of that condition, it won't survive 12 months. In other words, a qualified vet, a trained expert will tell you that whatever this issue is, let's say he checks the animal and he finds a sirche in the lung, for instance, some kind of wound or blemish in the lung, and he can tell you that with that kind of wound, even if the sheikh didn't sheikh the animal this morning, that animal would not have made it for 12 months. That is a treifa, an animal that will die on its own, even though it's not dead yet. And a treifa is not kosher. That's why when you go to the abattoir, when there's shchita, when they go to the shoftim, besides for the slaughterers who slaughter the animals according to our ritual laws, the laws of shchita, which are based on how the knife is, etc., and that has to be done in the way that it's done. You also have to have boidkim, checkers. Sometimes it could be the same shoftim, but sometimes it's rabbis. You have to have boidkim, people who check the animal afterwards, because sometimes post situation, you can actually see more than you could see before. They literally can open the animal and they're able to check the lungs, for instance, and see from inside the animal, a bit like a post-mortem, whether or not there are key issues that would have caused the animal to be a treifa. And if they discover that that is the case, then what they normally do is they would rule the animal out. It's no longer considered kosher. In today's day and age, it's easy because most abattoirs have a non-kosher side, so they can dispatch that animal in the direction of the non-kosher side. In days of old, it was much harder because the Jewish community and the Gentile communities didn't coexist as much. So if you were trying to shech the cow to feed your family or whatever, or to sustain a group of people, and now it gets declared not kosher, it could be a huge financial loss. In fact, there's a lot of places where it's spoken, where halacha will teach those who are checking to be careful, to at least be very careful not to rule it out too quickly, to try and figure out if they can save it, because it could be a big question of what's called chisra and kis. Financial loss of money. You can't just cause people to lose just willy-nilly. Today it's easier. That's why the truth of the matter is we actually, in some ways, can run a higher standard than generations before us, because it's easier to rule out things that are a question. So that's what a treifa is. And the Gemora is saying, the words mikol achai were required already to teach that, first of all, you can't eat a treifa, according to the laws of kashrut, but nobody can bring a treifa as a korban. If you know that this animal is a treifa, is going to die in the 12 months, then it shouldn't be brought as a sacrificial offering. So the Gemara says that milahacha yozera nafka, that you can learn out from the words lahacha yozera. When Hashem gave Noach the instruction to bring animals onto the ark, he made it clear that there's a purpose for this. We're not trying to make a zoo exhibit here. We're trying to make sure that after the flood is over and the world dries up, we can open the ark and take the animals out. And now that you've got samples of each type, they'll procreate once again, they'll reproduce, and we'll save all the species. There won't be any endangered species because we've managed to pack them all on the ark and save them. How do we know that? Because of the words that Hashem says, L'chayes zera ala oretz. That Hashem says to Noach, that's my intention. My intention is not to call it the end of the animal species, the end of the race, the end of the world. I want to save a piece of humanity. That's why you and your family are going on the ark. And I want to save all the species of animals. So says the Gemora, that when it talks about l'chayes zera, there is a discussion in the Talmud, in the Gemara, about whether an animal that's a treifa can actually give birth or not. There's a view that if an animal has the power to give birth, to procreate, then it cannot be considered a treifa, even if it has some kind of terminal problem. we can't call it a terminal problem if it can procreate, if it can produce. If it can produce offspring, then it loses the category of being a treifa. So he says, according to the opinion that a treifa is an animal that can't give birth. But there's another opinion that says that an animal can be a treifa. It can be declared on the one hand treif, that it won't survive the year, and it's a treif animal, and still it's possible for it to give birth. So then you learn that the concept of treifa from Lahacha Yezera, that Hashem told Noach that these animals must continue. They must procreate after the teva. Ma'ikala Maimar, how do you learn that these animals are not allowed to be treif? So then the Gemora says an interesting thing. Maybe Noach himself, we scratch for just about every possibility. Maybe Noach himself, even though he was being saved from the flood, maybe he had some, how would you call them, some personal medical problems that were not that he wouldn't survive. So when we said to Noach, bring the animals itach together with you, itach means animals like you. So just like you are potentially a treifa, somebody who, in other words, maybe Noach himself would not have survived 12 months after the flood because of his own troubles. So we would say that when we tell him that the animals must be like him, just like you are a treifa, the animals could also have been a treifa. Amar kra itach itach, but don't not like you. So in other words, we could say that just like we expect him to be healthy and survive, the animals too have to be healthy and survive. So the Gemara says, maybe Noach himself had a terminal problem. Sadly, sometimes people are ill. So the Gemara says that's not possible because he has a title. When he's introduced, it says, Eile told us, Noach. These are the generations of Noach. Tamim, Noach was Tamim. He was complete. Tamim ksiv bay, but Noach, it says he was complete. Complete means he wasn't a treifa, he was without blemish. So the animals that he brings onto the ark must also be without blemish. Says the Gemara Dilma, Tamim bidrachav. Maybe when we say complete, we mean behaviorally complete, not physically complete. Tzaddik siv bay, but it already says tzaddik. Noach ish tzaddik. If you want to know that his behavior was complete, it calls him a tzaddik. The word tamim must mean that the completeness was physical. Dilma tamim midrachav tzaddik b'ma'asav. Maybe you want to say that both refer to behavior. In his deeds, he was a tzaddik, he was righteous, and in his ways, that his attitudes and his more or less tangible actions or attitudes, he was tamim, he was complete. Bottom line says the Gemara, you cannot say that Noach himself was a treifa, was a person who would have not survived. If you want to say that Noach was a treifa, if he was like that, the apostle could have just simply said, Noach, just like you have, sadly, health problems and you're not going to survive, you should also know that animals that have health problems are not going to survive should not be the ones that you select. Now that we learn it out from the fact that the animals are comparable to him, why does the Torah have to say that the purpose of bringing the animals onto the ark was that they should procreate afterwards? Because if it just said that there must be some comparative between the animals brought onto the ark and Noah himself, we would think that maybe God's plan is not necessarily that there should be a huge reproduction afterwards. Maybe it's just Tzavta Ba'alma, they're all going to be on the ark together. We're going to have on the ark a party. We're making a nice big party exhibit. People can pay money like when they go to the zoo and they'll see an ark, and on the ark is a sample human being and his family, and there's samples of all the animals. But maybe God's will is not that they should all get off the ark down the line and reproduce and restart the world again. Who says? Maybe God's making a flood to destroy the world, and for a certain while, he's extending the situation by having a sample of all the species on the ark and a human sample, but not necessarily does that continue further than that. Just like these guys are dying in the flood, the ones on the ark maybe are also going to become endangered species. Why? Because maybe he'll bring animals that can't procreate, that have problems. He himself might have problems. Who says maybe afilu zaken, afilu saris, he could even bring old animals that can't produce. He could bring animals that are sterile. Maybe it's all about the social aspect of the animals. It's an experiment, maybe like in university. We're taking 2 of each type of animal and a bunch of humans, and we're sticking them on an ark for 120 days to see if we can have this human-animal coexistence society. Mashmalan, therefore, the Apostle had to tell you, Lahacha Yozera. God's intention was Lahacha Yozera, that there has to be a continuation of the species. In other words, it's very clear from those words, Lahacha Yozera, that Hashem's intention is that from this ark there should be zera, there should be offspring of people and animals forever after. And what's destroyed in the flood is destroyed, what continues afterwards continued. So basically, we'll end it there so we can discuss another subject for a few minutes. But the bottom line is that the Gemora went into the whole story of Noah and the ark to basically prove one thing, that the animals that are mechusar aver, that are missing limbs, are not fit to be sacrificial offerings, not for us and not for Gentiles. And also that animals that are a treifa, which means they have a terminal illness that will cause them to die within a year, are not good to be korbanos, not for us and not for Bnei Noach. What is the ramification of that? That if you are running a halachic state, so to speak, and you see even a Gentile offers an offering to some god, and you say, hold on a second, Avodah Zarah police are here. We want to see if you're serving Avodah Zarah. If that animal's blemished, then the person is not serving Avodah Zarah. Because in order to serve Avodah Zarah, the animal that's offered has to be complete. Just like if you would offer an animal in the temple, it would be complete. The animal that's offered out of the temple to any deity has to be complete. Without that completeness, if the animal's ill and it's a treifa, or missing limbs, or incomplete, or anything, then that's not considered avodah zarah. Okay, so let's.
So why, if a blemished animal can reproduce and do everything else, why is a blemished animal not kosher to eat? So
why is a blemished animal? It depends on the blemish. But it's the Torah says in general kashrut is a gzeira. It's not a logical thing. But the Torah says one of the laws of kashrut is that ubasar treifa, it says meat that's treif may not be eaten.
Like that animal can produce animals for us to eat.
So about that there's a debate. Whether the treifa can produce a kosher animal is a debate.
But you wouldn't know till it's dead.
Sorry? No,
so like the lung blemish, you don't know
it's more of a biological argument. It's more of a biological argument. In other words, the sages debate whether an animal that can reproduce could be called a treifa. There's a view that if an animal can truly reproduce, then the fact that it has other issues become nullified to the fact that it can reproduce. In other words, the power of reproducing is such a power that even if the vet is going to say this animal will die within 12 months, the fact that it can reproduce means that it can't be considered a treifa at all. It's not considered a treifa. There's another very similar idea that but when did I hear it? It was about in a whole discussion. We'll use the whiskey now. Thank you.
No, will it be all right? Before your blog.
We'll use that as the Kaufman's job.
What's in your whiskey?
I head off to shoot. So I'm already with luck.
In the whole discussion, and again, it's a discussion, it's a shiur of its own, and the guys are actually experts on it. It's not mine.
I'm still seeing rockets.
What is considered death in the whole dead transition from health to passing away, and brain dead, etc., there's a concept in halacha that if one can give birth, one can't be declared dead. So, for instance, like I think there's a discussion in a tshuva somewhere, I think even in the Talmud it's spoken of, that there was a particular animal that from a brain perspective, it was very limited, but it was able to give birth in that time. So then it was said that that animal can't be declared dead. In other words,
It's the same with like Ben Bacher.
very sadly, in one of the recent terrorist attacks, if you remember, there was that lady
Yeah.
who was shot, and the paramedics managed to take out the baby alive, although it didn't survive.
Yes.
Yeah.
It didn't survive.
And
but
was shot in the car.
yeah.
Oh.
Anyways, for just a quick, interesting topic, we said that besides for Gemora, we would have interesting topics.
Just repeat that the woman's baby was shot.
No,
She was shot.
She was
She was
shot.
expecting a baby.
Oh yeah, I heard the voice.
Yeah.
Didn't last.
And the paramedics realized that now that she was dead, the baby wouldn't be sustained in the womb. So they basically did, I don't know what the wording is, a cesarean, a Caesar, a person not alive. They took the baby out. They still managed to resuscitate it. In other words, heart was beating it. They put it in NICU, in like neonatal intensive care, and they were trying to save it. But unfortunately, the trauma of what happened to the mother was too much. And a few days later, the baby passed away.
She was a teacher.
I'm sure that's so sad.
I asked,
These bloody bastards.
I asked my son to suggest, we don't have a lot of time, just a few minutes, to suggest an interesting topic. And so he told me that a very interesting topic, which one wouldn't actually, not necessarily well known, is that, first of all, that when coffee was invented in the 16th century, in the 1500s, when coffee was discovered, coffee was actually very much a Jewish drink. It was Yidden that came up with it.
Really?
And there were a lot of halakhic responsa related to it. Yeah. Apparently,
When was that?
apparently in the 1500s. In the 1500s, it's credited that some shepherd, and I'll tell you how it affected, what the halakhic effect of it was. That until then, I think tea was around already, but coffee wasn't around. And there was apparently a shepherd that was looking after his goats, and some of the goats had got hold of some coffee beans, and they seemed to have, they were filled with a lot of beans and energy, and he realized that this must be a powerful substance.
Paid a fortune for those.
And eventually people started to use it to create a drink, and it was in North Africa and that kind of area, and it was very prevalent, especially among the Jewish community, and from like the Sephardi Jewish community, it moved into the Arab community, and from the Arabs and the Muslims, it moved also into Western Europe, became popular in Germany and in Germany and in England, and in some of those places they also started to develop, like we have our coffee shops today, coffee houses, and the reason why our sages were so into the development of coffee was because of the fact, you got to have tikkun chatzos, learning late at night. For all those that found the shiur a bit too late, it's a big schus that says V'agisa b'yom v'layla. You're supposed to learn Torah day and night, but for many years night was very hard because there was no electricity. Long before ESCOM came, there were others who also didn't provide electricity.
Came and went.
Long before ESCOM. Yeah. They say, what was there before candles? Electricity. So you ask the children in school, before there were candles, what did they use? Electricity. So basically people used to go to sleep early because the night was dark and whatever, and it wasn't easy to operate, to go around, and it was dangerous, and like electricity and power wasn't available. But the sages wanted to study. It's a big schus to study at night. So when coffee was discovered, it was a very powerful tool to keep us up at night and to keep us awake. And it became a very, very powerful tool of the early sages, the sages in the 15th century. And in fact, the Radbaz, who was a famous Sephardic sage, wrote a lot of tshuvos about coffee. And it also had to do with who made it. Now that there was a new substance in the world, they were trying to figure out, number one is what happens if the goyim produce it? Are we allowed to when it came to grapes and other things, there was a problem. Are we allowed to have the coffee that they produce? There was a famous story, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, the Yavitz, who was a very great sage from Western Europe. He traveled to England at one point, and he had coffee in a coffee house in England, and from I think it was Amsterdam in those days. It was from the middle, from the middle of Europe. And he traveled to England, and in England he had coffee in one of the coffee houses, and the local rabbis complained that they had made a gzeira. They didn't let their people sit in the coffee houses because they didn't want them to mix with the goyim, with the rest of society. And he came and he had his coffee there, and he came back to where he lived, and one of his friends said to him, he said, I'm hearing negative rumors about you. And he actually said that he studied the matter, and the way in which the coffee is produced, there shouldn't be a problem. It's not oila al shulchan malachim. It's not the kind of food that would go on the tables of kings. So the roasting of the beans is not a problem of bishul, of bishulakum, etc. But he did agree with him. He said, I made a mistake because the sitting in the coffee house in a place where the other rabbis, the rabbinates in England, had told their people not to sit in the coffee house, so I shouldn't have sat there either. But the substance itself, if you buy it and you take it home, then the substance itself should be okay, should be fine. And it's a very interesting thing, because even in today's day and age, what you find is that there's a lot of effort that goes into having kosher coffee shops, and it's quite important that when you're in areas like this where they exist, one should give them preference than sitting in the coffee shops that aren't kosher, that don't have a proper hechsher. Whereas the same thing doesn't apply if you're out in the sticks and you don't have a choice, then you can rely on these heterim, that it doesn't matter to drink it. But that was very much his view, that if you're in a place, where it's possible to do it differently, or you're able to take it home, it's one thing, but to have it in that place. And they were also very concerned in those days, because in society, our society and the rest of society were very, very separated. We didn't coexist a lot. But when the coffee houses opened in Europe, there was a lot of coexistence between our society and the others. In the early 1900s, like 1819, 1820, apparently because of the anti-Semitism, there were coffee houses which clearly said, and we know the same about clubs, that Jews are not allowed in. And in fact, sometimes the proprietors wanted the Jews to come in because they wanted to make money. They wanted to sell their coffee. And at one point in Hamburg, there was actually a riot, an anti-Semitic riot, and the riot broke out over a Jew in a coffee shop, a coffee house, because the balabos wanted the Jew to come in and pay. It wasn't that he was trying to be friendly, he just wanted his money. And he let him in, and others were angry that a Jew was allowed. Imagine the apartheid. A Jew was allowed to be in the coffee shop, and it turned into a whole riot. People were injured. It's just a very interesting subject that a lot of tshuvas, a lot of things were written about this substance, and history goes back to us. I mean, it's lastly to say that that there was a time that in the Arabic and the Muslim world, they actually called it mashka Yehudi, which means in their language, the Jewish drink. Yeah.
So now we better tell them they can't use their cell
Not
phones.
Turkish coffee, it's Jewish coffee.
Yeah.
Sorry, Michael,
They
you
can't
wanted
drink
to say.
coffee, they can't use their cell phones.
He's ingested
Mm.
by animal.
Yeah, that's the deer.
And they use the excrement.
The dung coffee.
Dung coffee.
Yeah.
Very expensive.
I heard it's actually rats.
Rory, they
Monkeys.
have coffee.
Monkeys.
in London.
Oh, really?
Monkeys.
Monkeys and
Yeah.
elephants. Oh, really? Oh, really? Interesting.
And also, you don't need to do Pushani and all that with coffee and Shabbos, because it's already,
Because it's already cooked, yeah.
unlike tea and so on.
Actually,
So
you
you
can't
can't.
coffee, the proper coffee machine, the whole booze.
I'm also a big coffee fan. And the other thing that's discussed a lot was in the discussions about what you're allowed to have before davening.
Yeah, yeah.
that tea and coffee were clearly stipulated that because it's the way. I think even the Mishnah Brura says that it's okay to drink coffee before davening. So they were worried about. There were certain.
Drink coffee before
Yeah, in fact, because it helps you concentrate.
Yeah.
Because it helps you concentrate.
More you can't eat rather than drink.
Yeah, but they discussed it. In other words, when coffee was first founded, it was a very interesting subject that the sages of the time would discuss. On the one hand, they were worried because coffee's social. So they were worried that people would schmooze and talk and forget to daven. That's also a risk. You know, if you're schmoozing and talking and running a huge social before davening, you might forget to daven.
They go to Sfardi, there's coffee and tea and everything
Yeah.
from the beginning of davening all the time.
I mean, we know that from a sheep.
Taken
It's
into
very
food.
easy to forget to learn. You have a whiskey and a bureka and a chat, and it can happen. You can forget to learn. So they were concerned that people would forget to daven. So they wrote certain shuvas that you have to worry about the coffee and the tea before davening. From that point of view, on the other hand, it helps people concentrate. So maybe they should be allowed to have it. The maskana of most halachic rulings is that you can have coffee and tea before davening. In fact, that if you need it for your concentration, it's actually better.
The only problem is you see today people coming to shul with a coffee.
Yeah.
I mean, while the davening is sipping coffee, and that I think it's not